All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rick Beels, and I'm a professor at this university, the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, in the philosophy department and the faculty of religion and theology. And it is my pleasure that we are having another lecture today in the Extreme Belief and Behavior lecture series in the Extreme Beliefs project at this university. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to briefly mention the reason why Professor Martin Accad is over, which is the dissertation defense of Scott Gustafson, sitting to my right over there, which will take place tomorrow, in defense of this dissertation, Reshaping the Ultimate Other, Levantine Conversion from Extremist Islam to Christianity through the lenses of de-radicalization and missiology. So that will take place tomorrow at 11:45, and you can join it online in case you're interested. Now let me move on straight away to introducing our speaker. Martin Accad was born in Lebanon and grew up and lived there through the Civil War in the 70s until 1990. He undertook seminary studies in Beirut and then completed a master's degree and a PhD at the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. He has been back in Lebanon since 2001 and served as chief academic officer at ABTS, so the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary, from 2001 to 2019 recently. He continues as associate professor of Islamic studies, both at ABTS and at the Near East School of Theology in Beirut, as well as affiliate professor at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. In 2020, Accad co-founded and directs Action Research Associates, an institute that uses research for the purpose of dialogue, reconciliation, and dealing with Lebanon's conflict past and present, maybe as well, to some extent. He may address that in his lecture. It's easier to do. Okay, fair enough. He has published many articles, and in 2019, the book Sacred Misinterpretation, with the subtitle Reaching Across the Christian-Muslim Divide. More recently, in 2020, he co-edited with Jonathan Andrews the volume The Religious Other, A Biblical Understanding of Islam, the Quran, and Muhammad. Martin Accad is a scholar and activist also, who seeks social-political transformation and the common good through the model and teaching of Jesus and collaborative research. With a mixed Lebanese and Swiss parental heritage, Accad is home in practically any culture, right? And lives and works in Lebanon by choice and calling. But that's a promising way to end this short introduction. It's fantastic to have you over at the Free University. So Professor Accad will lecture for about 45 minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A straight away. The first half will be recorded. The second half won't be recorded, so don't worry about privacy and so on. Right, that's what I wanted to say. Enjoy it, and Professor Accad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rick. I want to make sure first that my voice, so which microphone is picking up?
That one
over
is.
there. Okay, so
and I think people can hear you well.
Yeah.
I asked in the chat. Yeah.
All right. Good to see everyone around the table and online. Greetings to all. Rick had to justify bringing me just for the defense of Scott and asked me to give a lecture as well.
That was the reason, not the justification. The justification is the content, right?
You're talking to the philosopher.
I didn't know what to expect. Sometimes one should insult one party or another to cause a bit of controversy and draw more audience. But I'm very happy to see everyone around here and online, and probably some more people will be joining us. I'm going to reflect today on religious extremism and what it does to religions from the inside. My main case study is going to be Islam with reference to Daesh, or the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, Iraq, and the Levant. Daesh is the Arabic acronym for the same. And I'll be referring to it in one way or the other. I think everyone probably still remembers who I'm talking about. Christian theologians and other non-Muslim academics have spoken and written extensively about Islamism and religious extremism over the past 2 decades. But we are less prone to talk about extremism within Christianity or within right-wing politics. Perhaps this is because we live in an era where the connection between the Quran and religiously motivated violence is more obvious than between the Bible and religiously motivated violence. But in order not to be comparing apples to onions, we must not limit our inquiry to a single geographical location at a single time in history. Instead, if we want an accurate assessment of the potentials and realities of each of Islam and Christianity, we must compare as much as possible the phenomenon of religion and violence throughout the world and across the history of each religion. In the context of a fine academic institution such as this one, I suspect that it's unnecessary to burden the point on the danger of essentializing religion, on thinking about a religion as just one entity without nuance. I would argue, in short, that what defines a religion is what its adherents make of it at any time and place in history. Observed Christianity as manifested in an Egyptian monk in Upper Egypt in the 5th century will be dramatically different from that of a Southern Baptist churchgoer in the 21st century in Texas. The beliefs and practices of a Knight Hospitaller of the Order of Malta in the 12th century Jerusalem will manifest as radically different from those of an Amish in 18th century Pennsylvania. The worship style and liturgical practices of a 21st century German Lutheran will sound and look very different from those of a 21st century Nigerian Pentecostal. Yet they all claim and have claimed to be Christian and to be inspired by the teaching of Jesus and the Bible. Similarly, the observed Islam of a wine-drinking 8th century Umayyad caliph in Damascus looks quite different from that of an austere Sunni Azhari Imam of Cairo in the 21st century. The inspiration and practices of a 19th century member of a Sufi order in Morocco are radically different from those of a Daesh jihadist in 2015 northern Syria. And the piety of an Iranian Shiite of the 20th century will look rather strange when compared to those of a strict Saudi Wahhabi of the 18th century. Yet all of them claim to be Muslim and to be inspired by the Quran and the example of their prophet, Muhammad. One explanation for diversity within religions is scriptural interpretation. In Christianity, that applies especially to theological differences between denominations and sects. Though biblical exegesis has also played its part, of course, in Christian praxis, such as adopting various modes of baptism and the Eucharist, the wearing of a head cover, the consumption of or abstinence from wine and tobacco. Nevertheless, the varied exegesis of key passages from the New Testament is primarily important to our understanding of doctrinal history. Interpretation has segregated orthodox from heretic, saint from sinner. Through erudite patristic writings and imperially sponsored ecumenical councils, Ebionites, Arians, Nestorians, Monothelites, and iconoclasts were cut out from the company of saints. The arguments that sanctioned those decisions were largely exegetical in nature. This sort of exegetical segregation has continued throughout the history of the Church, right to the most minute contemporary subdivisions within Protestant Christianity. In Islam, Quranic interpretation has had more impact on Islamic practice than on sectarian division, though exegesis has also played a minor part on sectarian disagreements over free will and predestination, or over the createdness or eternity of the Quran. The legal jurisprudential core of Islamic hermeneutical method is likely the primary reason for this distinction from Christianity. When Muslim scholars approach the text of the Quran, they seek guidance for the minute details of their everyday lives and those of their communities, rather than theological insights into what and how to believe about God, evil, salvation, or the last day. They ask, what did Muhammad do, rather than what did Muhammad believe? Even the how of ritual practice, such as prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage, belongs to the realm of law rather than theology in Islam. Varied Quranic exegesis has led to vastly different convictions about the hijab, the use of wine, modes of inheritance, punishment for various crimes, from adultery to the abandonment of the 5 daily prayers. Scriptural interpretation has dictated diverse positions regarding the legitimacy of violence, combatant behavior in war, and the treatment of religious minorities within the realm of Islam. Another explanation for diversity within religions is geopolitical factors. Protracted conflicts between Rome and Persia influenced the theological choices of non-Greek speaking parts of the church, particularly in the debates that led up to the 4th and 5th ecumenical councils, Chalcedon in 451 and Constantinople II in 553. Western colonial ambitions of both Catholic and Protestant nations influenced theological loyalties and of subdued populations. Neo-colonial aspirations of America and Israel continue to influence the theological choices of Arab and non-Arab Christians on the questions of Zionism and eschatology. Mm-hmm. In Islam, it is political factors rather than theological ones that had a greater influence on sectarian divisions within the religion. It was conflicting political aspirations between Meccan muhajirun, the migrants that went from Mecca to Medina with Muhammad, and Medinan Ansar, those who supported him in Medina, that led to the great schism between Shiites and Sunnis over the question of divinely appointed leadership according to kinship or merit. The Battle of Siffin caused the emergence of the militant Kharijites or Khawarij over the question of holding a tyrant to account based on the measure of his religious piety. These internal fratricidal battles of history continue to stand behind the contemporary hatred and violence between the Shiite bloc headed by Iran and the Sunni bloc led by Saudi Arabia. Those ancient conflicts also stand behind the ongoing dread of Arab political leaders toward jihadi Islamists who will not abdicate their religious fervor to centralized political authority. I stated earlier that what defines a religion is what its adherents make of it at any time and place in history. I should make clear, perhaps, that I don't pretend to make through this thesis a statement about soteriology, but rather about religious sociology. In his book, What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic, Shahab Ahmad makes a strong case for this thesis. From militant jihadi expressions of Islam to the liberal consumption of wine by confessing Muslims, Ahmad adopts a socio-anthropological approach to affirm that every manifestation of Muslim life ever practiced with Quranic justification is a legitimate part of what we should consider to be Islamic. I would argue in the same vein that jihadi Islamists are no less legitimately Muslim than warmongering right-wing evangelical Zionists are to be considered Christian. Equally, peace-loving moderate Muslims are not to be considered less legitimately Islamic than pacifist Mennonites are to be considered genuinely Christian. Our position toward those we disagree with in our religious traditions should be one of hermeneutical debate rather than one of exclusion. In a recent book entitled The Claim to Christianity, Responding to the Far Right, Hannah Strömen and Ulrich Schmiedel examine Norway, Germany, and the UK as 3 case studies where far-right violent politics have claimed Christianity and to some extent the Bible as a significant part of their ideology. Claimants have been both politicians, religious leaders, but also, in the case of Norway, the perpetrator of a terrorist attack. Just as Shahab Ahmed asked in the title of his book, "What is Islam?" Strömen and Schmiedel ask at the end of their introductory chapter, I quote, "In the semantic struggle for Christianity, the issue is, what is Christianity?" The question is disturbing for the Church. We happily and extensively write about the religious and Quranic roots of violence in Islam. But are we willing to reverse the lens and examine religious and biblical roots of violence and right-wing politics that claim to be Christian? The question, if not straightforward in our self-examination, should neither be so simple when we ask it of Islam. Zia Meral, in his book entitled How Violence Shapes Religion, Belief and Conflict in the Middle East and Africa, judiciously reverses the question. After challenging common assumptions that essentialize religion and religionize violence, he suggests with René Girard that there is something far more profound and anthropological to violence than religion. Rather than asking how religion inspires violence, then we must ask how violence shapes religion. In the next and last section of my presentation, I will examine not so much how Islam is readily co-opted by violent men, but rather how violence in Islam's name is reshaping some of Islam's long-held assumptions, in this case, positively. When Daesh, ISIS, ISIL emerged publicly and dramatically on the world stage in summer of 2014, the Sunni Muslim world felt the tremor of its savage behavior as much as anyone else, though not in the same way, of course, as its direct physical victims. The ensuing months forced Muslim theologians of all brands to engage in an unprecedented soul-searching. In the 18 months that followed that fatal summer, I collected with some colleagues the closing statements of over 30 conferences organized globally by Muslim authorities and organizations, which had clearly been convened in response to ISIS. I was struck by some of the revolutionary conclusions and commitments surveyed in these documents. Daesh's justification of its actions based on the Quran and other Islamic texts imposed some unprecedented interpretive challenges on traditional understandings of these texts that religious leadership circles had to address, some for the first time in such a context. The shame and embarrassment felt within the Muslim world is reflected in the abundance of documents of self-justification that emerged within those first 18 months of the ISIS phenomenon. My assessment is that Daesh administered a considerable blow to a certain brand of Islamic traditional authoritarianism that had dominated Muslim societies for centuries. Among the first organizations that began to bring together religious experts to counter the impact and influence of ISIS was Accad in Vienna, Austria. In the next few slides, I'm going to go quickly over some titles of conferences that were held over these 18 months, which I've monitored with colleagues. I won't get into the details. I'll then summarize a little bit some of the main themes that I found there in those conferences. But if anyone is interested, I have more specific conferences and papers and position papers that come out of these. So among the first was Accad, a Saudi-sponsored organization based in Vienna, and the conference was entitled United Together Against Violence in the Name of Religion. There were follow-up conferences to this first conference in Beirut, in Paris, in Athens, and in Amman. In Paris, the conference was entitled, How do Freedom of Religion or Belief and Freedom of Expression Coexist in Europe? In Athens, Supporting the Citizenship Rights of Christians, Muslims, and other religious and ethnic groups in the Middle East. Echoing this initiative, another wave of international conferences began to be organized in order to condemn the acts of violence carried out in the name of religion, generally bringing together religious leaders of various Muslim sects, as well as of other religious groups. Among the most significant conferences organized early on to address this topic was the one that took place in Iran, in the city of Qom, in November 2014. Its title, the International Conference on the Dangers of Extremism and Takfiri Movements. Takfiri, for those who are not familiar, is the condemnation or the consideration that some Muslims are actually not Muslims. Takfiri movements are Islamist movements, some jihadi, some non-jihadi, but with an ideology that condemns up even leaders in the Muslim world whom they consider not to be good Muslims. It's a very volatile and in the eyes of Arab leaders, political leaders, dangerous stream that will easily wage war against them. So a conference held against the dangers of extremist and Takfiri movements from the perspective of Muslim scholars. This conference had over 1,000 religious leaders come together from 8 Muslim countries, including Sunni participants, which is unusual for a Shiite conference. A third wave of conference came to us from Cairo, from Al-Azhar, the official, one of the highest authorities of the Sunni Muslim world. In December 2014, you can see how very quickly within the first 4 to 6 months of Daesh's emergence in the summer of 2014, this conference entitled International Conference for the Confrontation of Extremism and Terrorism. Pope Theodoros II of the Coptic Church was present, a large number of Muslim scholars from everywhere, and leaders of Eastern churches. Very quickly for your eyes to see these many other conferences, you can see the titles in Mecca in February 2015, Cairo in the same month, Cairo in 2015, August 2015, Amman, November 2015, Baghdad at the end of that year, Tehran at the end of that year, January 2016. And these are only up to the time when I did this research until the end of January 2016. Among these conferences and statements, perhaps the Marrakesh Declaration is one of the most famous in January 2016. And I think a very important document that emerged, led by Al-Azhar in Cairo, the initiative of an open letter to al-Baghdadi that went up to, I believe, about 80 pages in Arabic. Very quickly, within 2 months of ISIS's emergence in September 2014, taking every statement that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi had made so far, every publication that had issued in the name of ISIS, and going through these statements in detail and refuting them and debunking them by interpreting the text of the Quran and Hadith differently from the way that they had been dealt with by Daesh and al-Baghdadi. These are only conferences that were held in the Muslim world, in the traditional Muslim world. But there were also many conferences in the West, including, for instance, the Islamic Supreme Council of Canada in March 2015 that brought together 37 Muslim leaders of various Islamic sects from across Canada. And they issued a fatwa condemning members of ISIS as non-Muslims. I want to mention these things because it is still very common to say that that everyone was embarrassed with Daesh, but nobody actually condemned Daesh as non-Islamic. That is actually not true from my research and monitoring of the situation. The motivation for these gatherings was, above all, deep embarrassment with ISIS's behavior in the name of Islam. In an honor-shame culture, that is a very significant motivator, but should not be dismissed as simply inauthentic for that reason. There was a strong instinct to rescue the image of Islam. We can identify from these conference titles that I just surveyed very quickly about 3 waves. The first wave was led by Qaisid, the Saudi-sponsored organization. It's King Abdullah Institute for Culture and something dialogue. Its main emphases were on coexistence, citizenship, and the importance of mastering the use of the social media to counter extremism. The second wave came to us, was led by Iran, but also by Egypt's Al-Azhar and by Saudi Arabia. And the main emphases here were on fighting takfiri extremism, even by going to war against them, counter-terrorism, and correcting erroneous beliefs. And the third wave was very interesting. It was led by President Sisi through Egypt's Ministry of Religious Endowment. He seems to have been unsatisfied with the way that Al-Azhar was responding too softly. I don't know if you remember, on New Year's Eve of 2014 into 2015, January 1st, he made a very strong speech in the presence of Azharite scholars where he practically rebuked them for not doing enough of a reform in Islam. A very embarrassing moment, I think, for them. So then he led a wave of conferences through the Ministry of Religious Endowment, which is a different authority from Azhar. These conferences focused on salvaging the image of Islam, renewing of the Islamic discourse, and centralizing the process of issuing fatwas or legal decisions or jurisprudence. These efforts expressed deep concerns in 4 main areas needing reform. The themes that emerged from this introspection were not entirely new, but to my knowledge, they had never been so broadly endorsed and so vehemently affirmed. These included radically revisionist views of classical concepts of jihad, the caliphate, and the very notion of an Islamic state. There were calls for comprehensive revisions of school curricula in the Muslim world, invitations for initiatives aiming at the formation of religious scholars and experts in addressing issues of jurisprudence through the social media, and a strong urging for a coordinated effort to dismantle takfiri fatwas, extremist jurisprudence that declares all those disagreeing with it as non-Muslims. I want to urge us not to underestimate, particularly this correction of what they refer to as false understandings of jihad, the caliphate, and the concept of an Islamic state. We probably are all familiar with the idea that when Kemal Atatürk abolished or brought the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1924, he also abolished the Islamic Caliphate in 1923. Since then, there were 3 immediately organized conferences in the Muslim world in the 30s, and if I'm not mistaken, one in the 40s, that considered the dramatic dismantling of the Islamic Caliphate. In Islamic thinking, there is a somewhat utopian conviction that from the time of Muhammad to the 4 rightly guided caliphs, into the Umayyad period, into the Abbasid period, into the Ottoman period, there was a seamless continuity of a centralized caliphal authority in the Muslim world. Now, those of us who are historians know that that is not as smooth as this idea is, but it dominates the popular consciousness of the Muslim world or Ummah. So the abolition of the caliphate in 1923, 1924 was considered one of the most tragic moments in Islam's entire history, and certainly of contemporary history. The 3 conferences that were immediately organized to try and resolve that tragedy or that crisis moment led to nothing. The Muslim countries ended up saying, well, we're going to postpone our final say on this matter. And then you have a few groups that begin to emerge in the 80s and 90s that claim caliphal authority, whether in the Middle East, some offshoots in Europe and the US and so on, but nothing as dramatic as the emergence of ISIS in the summer of 2014. One of the first events that ISIS did, which became very popular in the social media, was their dismantling of the historic border between Syria and Iraq. And that was almost 100 years after those borders had been established in the mid-First World War and end of the First World War, with the division of the Levant between Britain and France. And so a very important symbolic acts that I believe ISIS did very consciously with a lot of media exposure. So for these conferences to come and say a united centralized caliphate is unnecessary for a Muslim to live a genuine and faithful Muslim life is much more significant and important than we might think when we take it in a historical context. The idea that an Islamic state is not necessary for the right ethical behavior of a Muslim was not something to be taken for granted, was not endorsed by such a large number of scholars. For those of you familiar with Islamic jurisprudence and legal methodology, you know how consensus is important in establishing precedent in the Muslim world on which one can build in conversation and dialogue. Such statements stand in strong contrast with the continuing claims by many on the far right that once the Muslims are the majority, regardless in which country of the earth they have the religious duty to rule this country. This is a statement from the Sherman and Schmiedel book on someone else's authority. The statement might not be wrong if it were only referring to a description of a medieval Muslim political doctrine. But these recent conferences organized by Muslim theological authorities in Muslim lands against ISIS have made it abundantly clear that they do not subscribe to such views. By perpetuating such beliefs, Christian theologians and far-right and not so far-right politicians are consolidating extremist Islamist views on a constantly transforming Islam. Religions are heavy, deeply rooted institutions that will not be easily moved, but they are not static phenomena either. To the sharp eye of the historian and social scientist, it is clear that religions are in fact always on the move, even if this is more difficult to observe for the untrained eye. Religions are constantly transforming and adjusting to the new demands of changing contexts. Let me conclude by a reflection on Europe, inspired by the book of Stroman and Schmiedel. The nationalisms that manifested themselves in the early decades of the 20th century along the lines of race conflict were for a time kept in check by international human rights treaties following two disastrous world wars. But with the end of the bipolar world of the Cold War period, with the rise of globalization and the social media, and with the exacerbation of people migration resulting from ruthless wars in Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, it appears that what Stroman and Schmiedel call the new racism, disguised as a clash of cultures, is a return to the old human patterns of exclusivist identities vying for geopolitical control. As we learned from my context, the Lebanese model, and from the field of psychology, the exclusivist identity of one community is often affirmed through the identification of an anti-community and at the expense of that community. The situation currently developing in some parts of Europe, in example in the studies of Norway, Germany, and the UK in the book referred to, manifests the emergence of Islam and Muslims as the anti-community against which the European, quote unquote, seems to be pitting himself and herself against. And through the dangerous pitfalls of political correctness, races, ethnicities, and even religions, clash of cultures has emerged as the remaining acceptable moniker in the human search for exclusivist identity. I concur with the two authors about the importance of seeing, quote, the identity of Christianity as a project rather than a possession. I would add that hermeneutics is central to the idea of Christianity as a project rather than a static, essentialized reality. The same is true of Islam, the Quran, and its interpretation. As the authors affirm, quote, biblical interpretation cannot be fixed and finished in a search for an unequivocal meaning waiting to be found in the text. Biblical interpretation is a project. Scripture is lived. The same can certainly be said about the interpretation of the Quran and the ensuing and continuously changing manifestations of both religions. Finally, the weaponization of Islam by extremists against non-Muslims is paralleled by the weaponization of Christianity by extremists on the far right. And if we consider such weaponization as heresy, then it is the responsibility of theologians to dislodge it. As a Middle Eastern Christian, I am less impacted, though of course greatly concerned, by the influence of Christianity on the far right, and by the ways that this negatively impacts social relations between various religious communities in Europe. I don't know if I'm allowed to even refer to developments recently in the Netherlands.
You are.
On the other hand, maybe in the conversation, I'm significantly impacted, on the other hand, by the influence of Christian biblical hermeneutics on evangelical Zionism, and by the ways that this negatively impacts relations between Palestinians and Israelis, Christians, Muslims, and Jews. In the tragedy currently unfolding in Israel-Palestine, and in the current unfolding Zionist project that will no doubt end in the full annexation by Israel of Gaza, that is my conviction, and perhaps soon of the West Bank, I consider it supremely important that Christian and Jewish theologians should engage in scriptural interpretation that challenges Zionist ideological hermeneutics. Perhaps you here can do that better than I can, since as a Lebanese, I cannot engage with anyone in Israel, and with difficulty with Jewish theologians. The pen of Muslim theologians may not be freed to carry out the task of revisiting some of their dangerous Quranic hermeneutics until Christian and Jewish theologians freely, courageously, and prophetically engage their pen for the cause of human justice in the Palestine conflict. If unprecedented reform can be seen in Islam in response to feelings of deep embarrassment and shame with ISIS, in my view, the global Christian community has not yet reached the point where it is embarrassed enough, where it feels sufficiently ashamed with the Zionist Christian heresy, that we might witness significant reform that leads to justice in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Thank you.